A racist flight attendant accuses a black man of being drunk on the flight and humiliates him in front of everyone. She is shocked when the black man gets his revenge. Jared Thompson stepped onto the plane, his carry-on tucked under his arm as he moved down the aisle in search of his seat. It was a full flight, packed with passengers and the faint buzz of conversations, people settling in for the long haul across the country. As he reached his row, Jared stowed his bag and settled by the window, closing his eyes for a moment to steady himself. The week ahead was important, and he'd been running through notes in his mind, preparing for his upcoming meeting. "Excuse me, miss?" Jared flagged down the flight attendant as she passed. "Could I get a bottle of water before we take off?" The attendant, Amber according to her name tag, paused just long enough for a quick, appraising glance that flickered with a hint of something Jared couldn't quite name. It was subtle, but unmistakable. That slight wrinkle of the nose, almost like irritation. She didn't smile. "Water service will start after takeoff," she replied curtly, her tone leaving little room for follow-up. She moved on before Jared could respond, turning her attention to another passenger. Jared shrugged it off, chalking her attitude up to pre-flight rush. He leaned back, trying to settle in. Outside, the last few passengers trickled onto the plane. The hum of overhead announcements mingled with the sound of passengers adjusting their bags and finding their seats. As Amber passed by again, a woman 2 rows down asked for a glass of water, and Amber responded with a smile. "Of course, ma'am," she said warmly, her tone as crisp and refreshing as the glass she handed over a moment later. Jared caught the interaction out of the corner of his eye. He felt a faint tightening in his chest, but he pushed it down, reminding himself to keep his focus. A few minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing the usual pre-flight instructions. As they prepared for takeoff, Jared glanced over the rows, observing the passengers around him. People exchanged polite nods or murmured greetings, but he mostly kept to himself, eager to get through the next few hours without issue. As the plane lifted off, Jared's mind wandered to his meeting, the familiar pressure building in his chest. It wasn't just another work trip, it was an opportunity, a chance to make a meaningful step forward in his career. He'd been honing his presentation for days, hoping his work would speak louder than any preconceptions people might hold. The seatbelt light blinked off, and Jared glanced toward the aisle, catching sight of Amber distributing drinks a few rows up. He waited as she moved down the aisle, her steps steady, posture rigid. A man across from him ordered a soda, and she handed it over with a polite smile. Jared raised a hand, catching her attention as she reached his row. "Could I get a bottle of water now?" he asked, his tone calm but direct. Amber's gaze flickered down at him, her expression unchanging. "Are you sure you want just water?" Her words were soft but laced with a strange note, a tinge of something bordering on suspicion. Jared blinked, a bit thrown off. "Yes, just water." For a brief moment, her eyes seemed to search his face, as if she were gauging something. Then with a slight shrug, she moved on down the aisle without a word, leaving Jared empty-handed. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed, but the passengers nearby seemed engrossed in their own worlds, unaware of the exchange. The rest of the drink service continued without incident. Jared sat quietly, a feeling of unease beginning to settle in. He brushed it off, reminding himself not to overthink it. It was just water, no big deal. An hour into the flight, Jared's throat felt dry and his patience was wearing thin. The plane cruised smoothly at altitude, and most passengers were either engrossed in their books, drifting off to sleep, or typing away on laptops. Jared shifted in his seat, craning his neck to see where Amber was now. She'd been moving up and down the aisle, refilling drinks and checking on passengers, but each time she'd passed him, she hadn't so much as glanced in his direction. As she approached his row again, Jared cleared his throat and raised a hand. "Excuse me, Amber?" he called, keeping his tone even. "Could I please get a glass of water?" She turned her head, fixing him with a look that seemed almost disapproving. Her eyes narrowed slightly. This time she leaned down, close enough for him to catch a whiff of perfume mixed with an edge of something sharper in her expression. Her voice dropped low. "Sir, are you sure you didn't bring anything else to drink on board?" She made a show of glancing around his seat area, as if she expected to find something hidden. "You know it's against policy to bring alcohol on the plane." Jared's eyes widened, caught off guard by the accusation. I didn't bring anything on board," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I only asked for water." Amber's eyes narrowed further, and she sniffed the air almost theatrically. "I can smell it," she said, her tone clipped. "Your breath. It smells like liquor." She leaned back, arms crossed, as if she had already confirmed her suspicions. Jared felt a spark of anger, quickly suppressed. He wasn't about to let her assumptions slide, but he knew he had to tread carefully. "I'm not drinking anything," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. I haven't had a drop. Amber gave a small, skeptical shake of her head, still looking down at him with that faintly disdainful expression. Just so you know, sir, she continued, her voice louder now. If there's any trouble or disruption on this flight, I have full authority to call security upon landing. The few passengers nearby stirred, glancing over at the commotion. Jared could feel their eyes on him, and he shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares. His mouth opened to protest, but he stopped himself, realizing that anything he said could easily be twisted. Taking a steadying breath, he replied, I understand, and I'm not causing any trouble. I just want some water. She gave him one last look, her lips pursed, and without another word, she moved down the aisle. Jared leaned back in his seat, trying to process what had just happened. His initial shock quickly morphed into irritation, simmering beneath the surface. All he'd done was ask for water, yet she'd found a way to turn it into an accusation, to cast him in the worst possible light. He caught sight of a man a few rows up giving him a sympathetic nod, but the silent support only intensified his frustration. He shouldn't have to endure this kind of treatment on what should have been an ordinary flight. Minutes ticked by, and still, no water came. Finally, Jared decided he couldn't just sit back and let this pass. He flagged down the other flight attendant, a younger woman with kind eyes named Lisa, who had passed by without incident earlier. She looked down at him with a polite smile. Hi, excuse me, he said, doing his best to keep his tone casual. Could I please get a glass of water? I haven't had any yet. Lisa hesitated, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Amber was speaking to another passenger. She gave a quick nod, leaning closer. I'll be right back with that, she whispered, as if wary of being overheard. But before she could take a step, Amber reappeared as if she'd been watching. She intercepted Lisa with a sharp look. What are you doing? Amber asked, her voice a thin line of authority. Lisa stammered, gesturing toward Jared. Just getting this passenger some water, Amber. Amber's face hardened, her tone cold and unyielding. I already told him. No alcohol. I'm not enabling drunk passengers on my flight. She turned her gaze on Jared, her eyes narrowed. Are we clear? Jared clenched his jaw, his voice low. Crystal clear. And just for the record, I've been asking for water, not alcohol. Amber raised her brows, an unspoken challenge in her eyes. And I've made it clear that disruptive behavior won't be tolerated. She glanced at Lisa. Move along, she said, dismissing her with a curt wave. Lisa looked back apologetically at Jared before walking away. Jared settled back into his seat, his throat dry, his face hot. He felt trapped, a wave of helplessness creeping in. His initial shock had now solidified into anger. A deep, simmering anger at the way Amber had turned something as simple as asking for water into a power play, leaving him both humiliated and parched. From his peripheral vision, he saw a few other passengers glance his way, some of their expressions mixed with discomfort or vague judgment, others seeming to look on with faint sympathy, but unwilling to intervene. He couldn't decide which reaction angered him more, the silent judgment or the silent support. The hours stretched on as Jared sat there, feeling the discomfort gnawing at him from the inside out. But he clenched his fists and held his ground, refusing to let her see how much her pettiness was affecting him. The plane droned on, thousands of feet above the ground. Yet for Jared, the journey felt like a slow descent into a simmering frustration he couldn't shake. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, but he swallowed down his pride, determined to endure Amber's petty display of power. He told himself he'd be fine, that all he had to do was get through a few more hours. When the meal cart rolled down the aisle, Jared watched as Amber, once again, moved deliberately past his row without making eye contact. He waited, hoping she'd return, but each time she got closer, she'd glance his way, only to immediately redirect her attention elsewhere. His stomach growled, and his throat was dry, but he hesitated to call out, knowing it would only invite her disdain. By the time the meal service was nearing its end, he couldn't ignore the ache of hunger any longer. Taking a breath, Jared raised his hand to signal Amber as she came around for the final few rows. Amber, excuse me, he called out, forcing his tone to remain polite. She stopped, her expression flat. Yes? Jared kept his voice steady. I haven't received my meal yet. She looked him over, her expression hardening. Are you sure you really need it? She asked, her voice dripping with an almost mocking sweetness. I mean, considering, she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Jared's brow furrowed. Considering what? He replied, his voice edged with controlled irritation. Amber gave him a pointed look, crossing her arms. You know, she said softly, casting a quick glance to the row behind him. With whatever you've got in your system, I'm just saying maybe you should skip it. Jared's patience snapped. I don't have anything in my system. I haven't had a single drink, and I'd like my meal and a glass of water like everyone else. Amber tilted her head, feigning innocence. There's no need to get defensive. I'm just trying to ensure all my passengers have a safe flight. Jared clenched his fists, his voice dangerously calm. All I've asked for, multiple times, is water and food, which I believe I'm entitled to as a paying passenger. A few passengers nearby were watching the exchange closely now, their eyes darting between Jared and Amber, their discomfort plain. Before Jared could say anything more, Amber leaned down closer to him, her voice low and icy. Sir, if you continue to raise your voice and make demands, I'll have no choice but to report you for being uncooperative. We don't tolerate aggressive behavior here. Jared's mouth opened in disbelief. Aggressive? He echoed, his voice a low, incredulous whisper. I'm just asking for basic service. She straightened up, shrugging with an air of finality. Perhaps next time you'll think twice about your choices before boarding a plane, she said, loud enough for others nearby to hear. With a curt nod, she moved on, leaving him once again without a meal or water. Jared sat back, the heat of humiliation and anger coursing through him. He felt eyes on him, passengers shifting uncomfortably, clearly torn between their curiosity and their desire to stay uninvolved. His hunger and thirst had become secondary to the shame burning through him. A bitter reminder that even here, thousands of feet above the ground, there was no escape from the assumptions people were willing to make about him. At that moment, he noticed a man a few rows up making eye contact with him. A businessman in his 50s who'd watched the exchange with a frown. The man, Mark, gave Jared a small nod before reaching into his own carry-on and pulling out a bottle of water. With a quick glance around to make sure Amber wasn't looking, Mark leaned over and extended the bottle to Jared. Here, Mark whispered. Looks like you could use this. Jared took the bottle gratefully, nodding his thanks. I appreciate it. Just as Jared unscrewed the cap, Amber appeared at the end of the row. Her eyes zeroed in on the bottle in Jared's hand, and her face contorted in anger. She stormed over, snatching the bottle from him before he could take a sip. Sir, she began, her voice dangerously low. I made it clear that passengers are not permitted to consume outside beverages. Jared exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. Mark offered it to me. I haven't had any food or water since we took off. Amber scoffed, looking to Mark with a stern glare. I'm afraid I'll need you to move to another seat, she told him. We don't encourage passengers to interfere with each other's requests. Mark's expression was a mix of confusion and indignation. I was just trying to help. He's been sitting here without any service since we took off. Amber's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone clipped and professional. It's for everyone's comfort and safety, sir. Now, please, I need you to move. Reluctantly, Mark picked up his belongings and moved to the seat Amber pointed out, shooting Jared one last apologetic look before settling in. Jared watched him go, feeling his isolation grow heavier with each passing minute. He turned his gaze out the window, clenching his jaw as he fought the urge to confront Amber further. With each petty act, she was making it painfully clear that she held all the power on this flight, and every ounce of it seemed bent on making his experience as miserable as possible. Hours remained before they landed, but already, Jared could feel a storm brewing inside him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold back the words he so desperately wanted to throw in her face. Jared's patience was nearly gone, his anger simmering beneath a forced calm. He tried to distract himself by looking out the window or focusing on the hum of the plane's engines, but his thirst and hunger clawed at his attention. His temples pulsed with a growing headache, his body exhausted from a simple need denied. Amber's actions felt more personal with each passing hour. When he saw Lisa, the younger flight attendant, walking down the aisle again, Jared seized the opportunity. She had a kind, if nervous, look about her, someone who seemed to want to help but was wary of stepping out of line. He leaned slightly into the aisle and whispered as she passed. Lisa, he said softly, careful not to draw attention. I hate to bother you, but could I please just get a bottle of water? I haven't had any since we took off. Lisa glanced around, her eyes darting to where Amber stood several rows away. She hesitated, but finally nodded. Let me see what I can do, she whispered, giving him a small smile before she hurried off. Moments later, Lisa returned, placing a small water bottle on his tray as inconspicuously as possible. Here you go, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Just don't let her see. Relief flooded through Jared. Thank you, he said, keeping his voice low. Really? Lisa nodded, offering him a quick sympathetic smile before moving on. Jared opened the bottle and took a long, much-needed sip, feeling the cool water soothe his dry throat. For a brief moment, he felt some measure of comfort, some acknowledgement that at least one person on this flight saw him as human. But the relief was short-lived. Just as he was about to take another sip, Amber appeared. Her expression twisted into a mask of displeasure as she zeroed in on the water bottle in his hand. Her lips pressed into a tight line, her nostrils flaring. "Sir," she said icily, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "didn't I make it clear that outside beverages are not allowed on this flight?" Jared closed his eyes, taking a deep breath before he responded, trying to remain calm despite the humiliation bubbling inside him. "I asked Lisa for this," he replied, his voice controlled. "It's just water." Amber's gaze flicked over to Lisa, who stood a few rows back, her face pale. Amber's lips curled into a sneer. "I thought I was clear about this. You're not special. The rules apply to everyone," she said, her voice laced with condescension. Nearby passengers looked on, their faces a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Jared could feel their eyes on him, as though they were dissecting every aspect of the exchange. His throat dry again, he set the water bottle on his tray. "With all due respect, Amber, I'm simply asking for basic needs. This isn't about bending any rules." Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned down, speaking quietly enough that only he could hear. "You're becoming a nuisance," she said, her voice low and almost venomous. "If you can't handle the flight, I suggest you stay home next time." Jared's jaw clenched. Every muscle in his body tensed as he fought to keep himself in check. "All I asked for was water and my meal," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just like every other passenger." She straightened up, giving him a smirk before grabbing the water bottle and tucking it under her arm. "Maybe you'll think twice about being so demanding," she muttered, before turning on her heel and stalking away. Jared sat there, his frustration bubbling into anger as he felt the weight of everyone's stares on him. He caught the eye of a young woman a few seats away, who quickly looked down, embarrassed to have been caught watching. The quiet judgment in the cabin made him feel as though he were on trial, with Amber as both judge and jury. But Jared wasn't done yet. He raised his hand, his voice calm but firm. "Amber," he called, his tone steady and unmistakably serious. "I'd like to speak with the head flight attendant, please." Amber turned around slowly, a slight twitch in her jaw as she approached him. "You're looking at her," she replied, her tone dripping with superiority. "Then I need to know who I can file a complaint with," he continued, unshaken. "Your behavior has been unacceptable." A hush fell over the immediate area as passengers leaned in, straining to hear. Amber's eyes flashed with anger. "You want to file a complaint?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Go right ahead. In fact, I could call security and they would be waiting for you as soon as we land." Jared felt his pulse quicken. She was no longer trying to mask her hostility. Her threat hung in the air, thick and ominous, and he could see the smirk tugging at her lips, as if she took pleasure in the power she held over him. His anger surged, and he fought to keep his expression neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. "Fine," he replied, his voice steady, each word deliberate. "If that's what you think is necessary, I'll be ready to talk to them." Amber tilted her head, giving him a mocking smile. "Oh, I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about your behavior." With that, she turned and walked away, her posture rigid and victorious. Jared sank back in his seat, the weight of her threat heavy on his mind. She could have security waiting for him upon landing. She was painting him as a threat, an image he knew would be all too easy for some to believe. As he sat there, isolated and exhausted, he felt an odd mix of humiliation and anger. How had a simple request for water spiraled into this? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. His resolve hardened. He wouldn't let her see how deeply her words had cut. If she wanted to play this game, he would be ready. The minutes crawled by as Jared sat in silent fury, his body tense with suppressed frustration. Each bump and rumble of the plane seemed to amplify his discomfort, as though the very flight itself was echoing Amber's petty display of power. He saw her approaching again, her lips curled into a tight, smug smile. She stopped by his row, her voice loud enough to gather attention from several nearby passengers. "Sir," she began, her tone polished but icy, "it seems you're struggling to follow our flight rules, and I've received multiple complaints about your behavior." Jared felt the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. "Complaints?" he asked, keeping his voice low and controlled. "I haven't been disruptive. All I asked for was water and my meal." Amber didn't budge. "For everyone's comfort," she announced, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "I'm going to have to move you to a seat at the back of the plane." Jared's heart sank, and his face flushed with indignation. "There's been no disruption," he repeated, louder this time. "All I've done is ask for basic service." Amber's gaze hardened, her face twisting with barely concealed disdain. She leaned in close, dropping her voice, though her words were laced with venom. "People like you always think you're entitled to special treatment," she said, a sneer tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You think you can demand things that aren't yours, make a scene, and expect everyone else to fall in line?" Jared's stomach churned, his anger boiling over as he processed her words. "People like you." It was a phrase he'd heard enough times to recognize its ugly meaning, no matter how carefully she tried to disguise it. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice even. "I just want what I paid for. Same as everyone else on this flight." Amber's mouth twisted into a condescending smile. "Maybe if you acted more like everyone else, you wouldn't be having this issue." The words hung in the air, dripping with implication, loud enough for the passengers around them to catch. Jared saw a few passengers shift uncomfortably, their faces revealing an understanding they didn't dare vocalize. Some of them looked on with faint pity, but none spoke up. Gritting his teeth, Jared locked eyes with her, refusing to let her words break his composure. "I deserve to be treated with respect, just like anyone else," he said, his tone steady and unyielding. Amber scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Respect is earned, sir," she replied, the last word laced with disdain. "Now, if you're finished, kindly gather your things and follow me." Jared clenched his fists, fighting to keep his anger in check. Wordlessly, he stood, gathered his belongings, and followed her down the aisle. The walk to the back of the plane felt excruciatingly long, each step marked by the judgmental or uncomfortable stares of fellow passengers. He felt exposed, as if he were being paraded down an invisible line of scrutiny. Finally, they reached the last row, near the restrooms, where the hum of the engines was loudest and privacy was non-existent. She gestured to the cramped seat, her face betraying a twisted satisfaction. "This should help keep you out of everyone else's way," she said, her voice barely masking her contempt. Jared met her gaze, his face a mask of controlled anger. He refused to look away, even as she leaned down, her voice dropping to a mocking whisper only he could hear. "Consider it a little reminder," she said. "Maybe next time you'll remember that you don't own the world." Without waiting for a response, she straightened up and walked away, her posture triumphant, as though she'd just delivered a punishment she found fitting. Jared sat there in the cramped seat, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hum of the engines was deafening, isolating him even further from the rest of the cabin. He felt a strange mix of humiliation and defiance boiling inside him, a sense that he would not let her words diminish him, even if she held all the power here. The other passengers were silent, some casting pitying looks, others pointedly avoiding his gaze. The shame and frustration pulsed within him, but beneath it all, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let her win. He wouldn't let her words be the last he remembered of this flight. The dull roar of the engines filled Jared's ears as he sat in the cramped, uncomfortable seat at the very back of the plane. Every passing second amplified his anger, the injustice gnawing at him. Amber's words echoed in his mind, each loaded insult and sneer building into a fury that he could no longer contain. It wasn't just the thirst or the hunger or the humiliation. It was the final straw, the outright disrespect that she'd thrown at him, fueled by her own biases, her own prejudices. He'd tried to ignore it, to rise above it, but sitting here in isolation, feeling her eyes on him from the front of the plane like a hawk waiting to pounce again, Jared couldn't stay silent any longer. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, ignoring the stares of nearby passengers who looked up in surprise. He made his way up the aisle, his jaw clenched, determined not to let her get the last word. As he reached the front, Amber spotted him, her expression twisting into a smirk. "Back again?" she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I thought you'd be comfortable back there." Jared's voice was low, steady, but filled with restrained anger. "I'm done being treated like this. I'm a paying passenger on this flight, and you've gone out of your way to make this miserable." Her smirk faded, replaced by a hardened glare. "I'm simply doing my job, sir. It's not my fault if you can't follow simple instructions." Jared's hands tightened into fists. "Simple instructions?" he repeated, his voice rising. "I asked for water. I asked for food. Things that every other passenger has received without question. But when I ask, suddenly it's a problem?" Amber crossed her arms, her face a picture of forced patience. "If you'd behaved like everyone else, this wouldn't have happened. People like you always think you're above the rules." Jared's anger flared. "People like me?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You mean what exactly? Say it." Her cheeks flushed, but she refused to back down. "I mean people who think they can get special treatment by causing a scene," she shot back, the disdain in her voice thinly veiled. "Special treatment?" Jared's voice was nearly a shout now, and passengers all around were watching, wide-eyed and silent. I've been nothing but respectful, while you've ignored me, skipped me during service, and accused me of things I didn't do. You're the one who's been making a scene, not me. Amber's face turned red, her eyes narrowing. Sir, you need to lower your voice, or I'll be forced to have security escort you off this plane as soon as we land. Escort me off, Jared echoed, his tone filled with incredulity. For what? For asking to be treated like a human being? Nearby, a few passengers murmured in agreement, their whispers a quiet show of support. A man from a rowback spoke up, his voice hesitant but loud enough to be heard. He's right. We've all seen how you've been treating him. Amber turned her glare toward the man, her voice sharp. Stay out of this. This is a matter between the airline and a disruptive passenger. The man didn't back down. Disruptive? The only one making a scene here is you. The way you've treated him is completely out of line. Jared felt a flicker of relief, knowing he wasn't the only one who'd seen what was happening. Fueled by this support, he continued, his voice unwavering. I've tried to be calm. I've tried to be respectful. But you've crossed the line over and over. And now you're trying to throw me off the plane just because I dared to stand up for myself? Amber's voice grew colder. Enough. I warned you about your behavior, and now you're refusing to listen to instructions. Security will be waiting when we land. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder. One woman, seated a few rows up, turned to Amber, her voice tense with frustration. This is ridiculous. We've all been watching, and he hasn't done anything wrong. You've been targeting him for no reason. Amber's face flushed, her carefully controlled facade beginning to crack. She glanced around, her eyes darting over the watching passengers, and for a moment, uncertainty flickered across her expression. But she quickly composed herself, her voice dripping with contempt as she addressed Jared. If you can't handle following simple rules, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all, she sneered, the words loud and clear. Jared felt his anger surge, his voice ringing through the cabin. I'm done being quiet about this. You've treated me like I'm less than everyone else on this plane, and I'm not going to sit back and let you get away with it. Amber stepped closer, her voice a harsh whisper that only Jared could hear. I'm in charge here. You don't get to decide what's fair or not. You're nobody on this plane. Jared's expression hardened, his voice clear and unwavering as he replied. I may be nobody to you, but that doesn't mean you can walk all over me. I'm done playing by your rules. The surrounding passengers grew louder, a few more voicing their support for Jared, their words blending into a rising chorus of disapproval aimed at Amber. Her face blanched as she looked around, realizing that the situation was slipping out of her control. Finally, an elderly woman near the front called out, her voice strong and unwavering. Young man, you're not alone here. We've all seen what's going on. Amber's composure faltered, her eyes darting around in frustration and anger, but she quickly straightened, holding on to the last shreds of her authority. Everyone, please, remain seated and let me handle this. The businessman who had offered Jared water earlier shook his head, his voice carrying through the tense silence. You're the one causing trouble here, not him. Jared met Amber's gaze unflinching. I want a formal complaint filed, he said, his voice steady, and I'll be following up on it after we land. Amber opened her mouth to respond, but she was met with the stony faces of passengers who were no longer willing to look the other way. Her power, her authority, all of it seemed to dissolve as the passengers continued to murmur in Jared's defense. With a frustrated sigh, Amber turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, leaving Jared standing in the silence of the cabin. He felt the tension in his shoulders slowly begin to release as the adrenaline faded, the anger in his chest giving way to a sense of vindication. A few passengers offered him small nods and murmurs of support, the shared outrage in their eyes a quiet reassurance. Jared sank back into his seat, his heart still pounding, but his spirit unbroken. This wasn't over yet. As the plane began its descent, Jared's pulse quickened, a mix of anger and apprehension building in his chest. Amber had disappeared to the front of the cabin, likely preparing for the fallout she'd orchestrated upon landing. Despite the quiet support he'd received from other passengers, Jared knew she still held the upper hand. For now. The plane touched down, the tires hitting the runway with a jarring thud. Jared took a steadying breath, readying himself for what awaited him outside. He felt the stares of passengers around him, some filled with sympathy, others looking on in silent support. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Amber's voice crackled over the intercom, her tone carrying an unmistakable edge. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. Please remain seated until the plane has reached the gate and security has arrived to assist a passenger. Murmurs spread through the cabin. Jared clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed forward, determined not to let her see him rattled. When the plane finally stopped, the seatbelt light clicked off, and a tense silence hung in the air. Passengers remained seated, their eyes following the scene unfolding before them. Moments later, 2 airport security officers appeared at the front of the cabin, their expressions neutral but focused. Amber greeted them, her face painted with a look of feigned professionalism as she pointed back toward Jared. The officers made their way down the aisle, their eyes settling on him. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, gave him a curt nod. "Sir, we'd like to speak with you outside the aircraft," he said, his voice firm but calm. Jared stood, his expression steady, meeting the officer's gaze. "Of course," he replied evenly. As he walked down the aisle, he felt every passenger's gaze on him. Many looked on with quiet outrage, a few nodding in encouragement. But Jared was focused, his resolve unbroken. Amber stood by the front, arms crossed, watching with an unsettling smirk that she didn't even try to hide. As he passed her, he stopped briefly, his voice low but steady. "This isn't over." Amber's smirk widened, and she leaned in, her words a barely concealed hiss. "You people are all the same. Drunk, loud, and always looking for a handout. You got exactly what you deserve." Jared's eyes flashed, his voice as calm as it was resolute. "We'll see about that." She gave a dismissive shrug, as though she'd already won, and stepped aside to let him pass. Jared walked down the jet bridge with the officers, his steps steady and unhurried. When they reached the end, the officers turned to face him, their postures relaxed but attentive. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, spoke first. "Sir, we understand there was an incident on the flight," she began, her tone measured. "Would you like to share your side of the story?" Jared took a deep breath, recounting the events from his initial request for water to Amber's escalating mistreatment, her refusal of basic service, and finally, her racist comments. He kept his voice level, laying out each detail with precision. He described how other passengers had witnessed her behavior and even tried to offer him support, only to be discouraged or moved. The officers listened attentively, nodding as he spoke. When he finished, the female officer exchanged a look with her partner before looking back at Jared. "We've already had multiple accounts from other passengers," she said, her voice professional yet empathetic. "Several corroborate what you've just described, and it seems this situation may have been mishandled by the flight attendant." Jared felt a wave of relief wash over him, tempered by lingering frustration. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I intend to file a formal complaint with the airline." The male officer nodded. "That would be the best course of action. We'll make sure everything is documented from our end." Just then, a few passengers began exiting the plane into the terminal. Mark, the businessman who had offered Jared water, approached, holding up his phone. "I recorded some of what happened," he said, looking at the officers. "It's all right here, and it clearly shows how she treated him." The officers' faces brightened with interest, and Mark handed them his phone. One of the officers watched the video, frowning as Amber's confrontational tone and Jared's calm responses played out on the screen. The video captured Amber's words perfectly, her disdainful remarks, her accusation that he was drunk because he was that type, and the final racial comment as Jared was escorted out. "This is incredibly helpful," the female officer said, nodding in appreciation to Mark. "We'll be including this as part of the report." One by one, more passengers stepped forward, offering their own videos and recounting their experiences of Amber's behavior toward Jared. Several had captured her refusal to serve him, her dismissive tone, and the final exchange where she'd made her bias clear for all to see. The officers documented each account, clearly taking the matter seriously. When Amber finally disembarked, she froze, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the scene. Security officers with collected evidence, passengers supporting Jared, and the unyielding expressions on the officers' faces. Her previously smug demeanor faltered as she realized the situation had turned against her. The female officer stepped forward, her tone now noticeably colder. "Ms. Foster," she began, "we have multiple accounts from passengers that indicate you acted inappropriately and used offensive language. We'll be forwarding this report, along with video evidence, to the airline." Amber's face blanched, and she quickly forced a weak smile. "I was just doing my job," she stammered. "I have the authority to make decisions for passenger safety." The officer's expression didn't soften, "and we'll let the airline review those decisions. For now, I recommend you speak with your supervisor." Amber's face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear as she looked around at the passengers, many of whom were staring back with disapproval and judgment. Her gaze met Jared's, and he held it, his expression calm and unyielding. He didn't need to say anything. The support of his fellow passengers, the officer's stern response, and the damning evidence in those videos spoke louder than words. Without another word, Amber turned on her heel and walked away, her posture stiff, her face a mask of barely concealed shame and resentment. Jared took a steadying breath, the weight of the ordeal finally beginning to lift. Mark clapped him on the shoulder, offering a warm smile. "I'm glad you stood up for yourself." Jared nodded, a small, grateful smile crossing his face. "Thank you, Mark, and thank you all," he said, looking at the other passengers who had gathered around him in support. As he walked away from the gate, the frustration and anger that had followed him throughout the flight began to dissolve. He knew this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a powerful reminder that standing up against mistreatment mattered, and that sometimes people would step forward to stand beside you. And for Jared, that was the true victory. A week after the flight, Jared received a call from the airline's customer relations department. They invited him to attend a formal review meeting regarding the incident, assuring him that his concerns were being taken very seriously. He agreed, determined to see this ordeal through to its conclusion. On the day of the meeting, Jared walked into the airline's corporate office with a calm determination. He'd come prepared with his own account of the events, and he knew that other passengers had submitted statements and videos corroborating his experience. The airline's review team, made up of a few executives and a human resources representative, greeted him politely and led him to a large conference room. As he sat down, the HR representative, a woman named Ms. Carter, addressed him with a respectful tone. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming in today. We wanted to hear your side of what happened on your flight in person. We've reviewed statements from other passengers and collected evidence, but your experience is important for us to understand fully." Jared nodded, appreciating the gravity with which they were handling the situation. "Thank you for giving me the chance to speak." Ms. Carter gave a small, encouraging nod. "Please, take us through everything from the beginning." Jared recounted the flight in detail, describing Amber's dismissive behavior from the first time he'd asked for water. He spoke of her accusatory comments, the repeated denial of service, and her baseless insinuations about him being intoxicated. Finally, he recounted her racial slurs, the humiliation of being moved to the back of the plane, and the threat of security waiting for him upon landing. As he spoke, the review team listened intently, taking notes and occasionally exchanging glances that betrayed their concern. When he finished, he sat back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ms. Carter glanced at her colleagues, then back at Jared. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that this behavior is not only against our policy, but entirely unacceptable in any setting. We've reviewed the video footage submitted by other passengers, and it's clear that the flight attendant's actions were out of line and deeply unprofessional." One of the executives, a stern-looking man in a suit, leaned forward. "We've taken swift action based on the evidence and the testimonies of other passengers." Ms. Foster, Amber, was given an opportunity to explain her side, but her account conflicted significantly with the evidence provided by you and others. Ms. Carter took over, her tone serious yet reassuring. "Given the severity of her conduct and the corroborating accounts of multiple passengers, the airline has terminated Ms. Foster's employment. Her actions violated our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. There is no place for that behavior in our organization." Jared felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over him. The entire ordeal, the humiliation, the unfair treatment, the disregard for his dignity, was finally being addressed. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "I appreciate that the airline took this seriously." Ms. Carter offered a sympathetic smile. "We can only imagine how difficult this must have been for you, and we apologize sincerely for the experience you endured. This was not only unprofessional but deeply wrong, and we will be revisiting our training protocols to ensure this never happens again." The executive nodded in agreement. "Additionally, we'd like to offer you compensation for the flight, as well as a formal written apology from the airline. This does not erase what happened, but we hope it conveys our commitment to making things right." Jared accepted, knowing that while no apology or compensation could fully erase the memory of what he'd endured, it was a meaningful gesture. He appreciated the respect and professionalism they were showing now, contrasting sharply with Amber's behavior on that fateful flight. As the meeting concluded, Ms. Carter walked him to the door. "Mr. Thompson, thank you again for speaking with us. We know this won't erase the past, but we hope it restores your confidence in our airline." Jared shook her hand. "I appreciate the steps you're taking. I just hope this sets a precedent so no one else has to go through what I did." As he walked out of the building, Jared felt a sense of closure settle over him. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice. Knowing that the airline had held Amber accountable for her actions brought a sense of justice he hadn't anticipated. For Jared, The experience had been a difficult reminder of the biases that still linger in unexpected places, but it had also revealed the power of resilience, of standing up not only for himself, but for those who might not have been able to. And now, with his dignity intact and his voice heard, Jared could finally move forward.